What is up, you guys? Glitchiz here, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm bringing you my ultimate warrior guide for the Frozen Frontier update. A lot of you have been anticipating this final class build as well, so I'm happy to finally bring it to you guys. I'm sorry for the delay. It took me a little longer to do this one than the other builds because there's a lot more stuff that I had to test for it. And I kind of wanted to challenge myself and make this a pure warrior build that relied as little as possible on range damage with a bow. That includes fighting the dragon boss. Any chance where I could stun and take the boss down with normal shield parries and things like that, I did with this particular build, and it's why I built into certain things the way I did. You're going to be able to take out everything across pretty much every difficulty in the game with ease without having to use a bow with some of the other abilities that we selected as well. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. I will say, much like my other build videos, that this probably will be a little bit longer. I want to go over some testing and things like that I found along the way. So I'm going to be having timestamps down in the description to break this up into categories so you guys can jump to each section a little bit more quickly. So feel free to check that out. And I will also, on the first line in the description, be posting our web UI link for the skill tree build for this particular build, so you guys can have a little cheat sheet to look up after watching the video to kind of reference this build a little bit more quickly as well. So be sure to check that out too. But moving on, first thing that I want to jump into is the armor. So let's go ahead and do that. And some interesting things that I found out while testing this. For the helmet, there's going to be two options that I would recommend. The first main go-to one that I use when I'm just typically running around and exploring is going to be the Mountains Shadow Helmet. This will give us 16% melee critical strike chance, 14% critical strike damage, and +2 frost resistance. The alternate helmet that I would potentially recommend, it's not going to be best in slot, but in particular scenarios, potentially in the dragon boss fight, I do use this on occasion depending on the difficulty I'm on. Unfortunately, what I found with this alternate helmet, which is going to be the Brazen Bull helmet, is for some reason the devs decided to, I don't want to say nerf, but make parry power a little bit underwhelming. Ideally, I wish they balanced it to where you could two-shot stun the boss if you did a successful parry, so that way within one round you could down the dragon the same way and the same speed that you could with the hunter, for example. But unfortunately you can't. So I tested a lot of parry power with this particular helmet because this one gives another 42 parry power. And for those of you who don't know, the stun damage that you do to enemies scales with your parry power. So the idea I had originally was to run as much parry power as possible alongside some of my other armor to try and down the dragon as much as possible. However, what I found out through testing is that no matter how much parry power I stacked, you couldn't down him with just 2 of the meteor balls. It takes at least 3, which means you're going to have to wait for 1 second rotation to be able to fully take him down if you don't use a bow. So if that's the case, then using this helmet isn't necessary, because with just your normal shield, using the helmet that gives more attack damage, you would still only get the 2 parries of the meteor balls as well. So if you can take them down in the same amount of counters, then there's no point in stacking more parry power if you don't need it. So that's why best in slot, in my opinion, is going to be the Mountains Shadow Helmet. But for lower enemies that might not be boss enemies, if you want to like mass stun enemies, this is a fun one to use. You can like almost max entire groups of enemies stun bars with just 1 parry with the right perks. So that is a cool alternate one that you can craft. Moving on to the chest piece, my go-to that I always like to run, I've run this on every single build, is going to be the Mountains Shadow Chest, plus 30 stamina and plus 300 health. You just can't beat it. It's such a crazy huge boost there, as well as plus 4 frost resistance. Moving on to the gloves, there is 2 options you can craft for this, depending on which type of weapon style you prefer the most. I'm more of a sword and shield or mace and shield, one-handed type user. This build does have everything you need to do both one-handed and two-handed combinations. So this is totally up to you. Whatever weapon you plan on maining, I would recommend crafting both of these weapons. The first one being Wolf Fang's Gloves. This gives 15% one-handed melee damage bonus, as well as plus 4% damage against melee foes. While the alternate that you can craft is the Mountain Shadow Gloves. This will give the plus 4% against melee foes, but a 15% bonus to two-handed weapons instead, and 1 frost resistance. So both are pretty much identical. It just depends on what scenario you're running or what weapon you're primarily going to be using. If you're exploring, things like that, I typically use Sword and Shield, so that's why I run the Wolf Fang Gloves. But if you're running something like the Hollowed Halls, where you're going to be doing a lot of like jump smashes because the enemies are really tightly packed together, you'll most likely have your two-handed weapon out majority of the time. Then you might want to swap to these, so that's a really good alternate to have for those types of situations. So that's why I have those. Moving on to the pants. We have a non-warrior pants here. We had this in my hunter build. These are the Alpine Antler trousers, plus 22 stamina and plus 1 sprint speed, as well as 2 frost resistance. So we're pulling in some hunter gear here. The other interesting thing that I found out is hunter gear has a combined higher resistance between physical and magical than any piece of warrior armor. The same tier pants for the warrior has about at least on the gloves, for example, has 55 points of resistance total between physical and magical combined, whereas the hunter gloves have 60. So if we want to have the max resistance as possible across the board, it's actually beneficial to mix in some hunter pieces as well, just because their ratio of points is a little bit better. Plus, the one thing we're going to be lacking with a warrior, especially for doing two-handed down smashes constantly and using our grapple ability, is stamina. So having these pants really gives a big boost to our stamina pool. So that's why I bring those. And then last but not least, we're running another hunter piece, the Trailblazer boots, because that will give us a minus 700 stamina regeneration delay. So pretty much infinite stamina recharge. As soon as we hit 0, if we ever do, it immediately kicks in and starts recharging super fast. So you never really have to worry about running out. It also has an additional plus 4 stamina regeneration and another 2 frost resistance. So that is all of the armor pieces that I would recommend. Moving on to the rings. My oldies but goodies is the double ring of the ancients. Again, you can't really beat the stats that you get with 2 points into each of these attributes. Constitution 2 points is going to be 100 more health. We're going to get I think it's 5 or 10 strength. Let me go over to attributes. 5% more melee damage with strength. So you're getting 10% more melee damage there. It's just all around really good when using both. Depending on the scenario, Hollowed Halls, if you're going to have to kite around a lot or things like that, you could potentially run either an excellent health ring or an excellent stamina ring. That's totally up to you. But honestly, we're getting health and stamina with these rings as well. It's just you're losing out on a little bit of regeneration. So these are typically the rings I use the entire time, at least for the warrior. Moving on to the shield, this is important. I still run the Mountain's Shadow Shield because it has the highest parry power possible. Having the 2 or 3 points less in block, in my opinion, is not a big of a deal as having the higher chance to stun enemies quicker. So that's why I run this. If you want to focus more on just straight up blocking attacks in close quarters, then feel free to craft the shield that has more block. But all around, for the use case of this particular build, I like having the highest parry power possible. So that's why I run this. For the bow, honestly, I'm trying to build this entire warrior build around the least use of bows as possible. I want it to be full warrior, just to show you guys that it's possible. So I run the ignited bow, which is the best base damage bow in the game right now, in my opinion. Plus 3 or plus 7 fire magic damage perks 3 times, head seeker for increased stamina if you get a headshot, and recharge, which gives another health regeneration. So best one-off bow that you can get, in my opinion, there. But moving on to the two-handed and one-handed weapons, which is really interesting, and some things I found that I want to show you. Let's start with the one-handeds first. I'm going to bring 3 in particular, but there is 2 honorable mentions that I wanted to talk about. The first one that I always bring with me is going to be the new upgraded level 40 Sword of Radiance. This has always been my go-to health regen sword, because there's a perk in the skill tree that we're going to be taking where on a successful critical hit with a melee weapon, we get 5% of our health back. And this this has the highest critical chance swing of any weapon in the game. It's got 3 precise perks on it, as well as 2 brutal perks to make those critical hits do 40% more damage. So it has the lower end of raw damage output compared to the other ones we're going to be using, but it has the fastest health regen of any weapon that we're going to be using. So I always take this in a pinch. You just whip this out, slice into a couple packs of enemies, and you refill your health up almost instantly. If we go into our character attributes here, with all the perks that we're going to be taking in combination with that sword, if we go ahead and equip it here, you'll notice that our critical strike damage, or critical chance rather, is sitting at 30%. Actually, that should be higher. Oh, duh. It's because I didn't equip my helmet back. So now if we go back to damage, we're sitting at 46% with that Sword of Radiance critical strike chance. So almost every other hit is going to be a lifesteal hit. So that's why I use that. But moving on, go to our bag here. The other one-handed melee options, best in slot for damage is going to be, at least in the newer areas, the Mace of Wrath. And to prove this, I'm going to head and show you guys to my new best friend, aka the best test dummy in the game, and that is the crafting bench. Our test dummies that we can craft actually break after a few hits, whereas this can test raw damage with no attributes very easily. So if we look at the damage here, and just so I can test this, by the way, the alternate option that I was testing as the second best would be the Gore Striker. So let's go ahead and equip that. So the Gore Striker, by default, if it doesn't crit here, I'm just critting like crazy right now, is 507. If we do this one, we're getting 528. So the base damage is a little bit better. Even though the only perks that we're taking to upgrade in our skill tree is piercing and blunt, which both of these have only 1 piercing and 1 blunt. Gore Striker has 1 piercing, 1 blunt. Mace of Wrath has 1 piercing, 1 blunt, as well as 3 other random unbuffed damage perks. In this case, Mace of Wrath has 3 plus 14 ice magic, and Gore Striker has 3 other magics, 2 shroud and 1 shock. The reason why I think the Gore Striker does slightly less damage, at least raw damage output, is because the damage type is split up 50-50 between blunt and shroud. So 50% is being buffed and 50% is not being buffed. Whereas with the Mace of Wrath, we have 2/3 of our, or 2/4 of the, well, I guess just half rather of our damage being blunt, that's being buffed, as well as 1/4 of piercing being buffed, and then only 1/4 isn't being buffed. So that's the main difference. Gore Striker, 50% is not being buffed, and on the Wrath, 25% is not being buffed. So I think that's where we're getting that little bit of extra damage boost. Now, the thing I want to point out is the bonus damage for the Mace of Wrath is coming from ice magic damage, which all of the enemies in the newer Albany Summits territory are weak against to that element. They're weak to frost. So you'll do even more damage with this weapon in the later tier zones. If you're in the older tier zones, like the Kindle Waste, though, for example, all of those bandits are typically weak to shroud damage. And when I did my testing, the Gore Striker was actually doing slightly more. So if you're in the older, lower territories in the map, feel free to use the Gore Striker, but both of these are very good options, just flat out, at least with this particular build, in all the areas that we're pretty much going to be using it. This will have the highest one-handed damage of any of the one-hitters that are out right now, so that's why I run that. But Gore Striker, good second option. And then moving on to the two-handeds, this is another interesting scenario that I came across. The 2 best in slot options are going to be the Frost Smasher, which is a new two-handed hammer in the new update, as well as the upgraded level 40 ignited hammer. Now on paper, these should do the exact amount of raw damage. It should be exactly the same. They both have 100% blunt spread across the damage type, and they both have 5 plus 21 blunt damage perks. So on paper, they should be exactly the same. But for whatever reason, from my testing, what I found out is the ignited hammer does 740 base raw damage, whereas the Maw does 745. So slightly more damage for some reason on this two-handed mace, even though the stats are exactly the same. like literally point for point, at least for damage perks, they are exactly the same. For whatever reason, the new Frost Smasher does slightly more damage than the Ignited Hammer. That being said, if you want to go for max parry, which in certain situations we may want to, because you actually can parry with two-handed weapons as well, you don't have to use your shield. One thing that I did notice is that on the Frost Smasher, we have a 125 parry power rating, but on the Ignited Hammer, we have a 137 parry power rating. So speeds and damage on paper should be exactly the same, but for raw DPS, the Frost Smasher is going to be the best. For parry power, the Ignited Hammer is going to be the best. So depending on which type of kit you want to run and what style of gameplay you're going to be playing, both are going to be very good options, but have a slight edge in a different category. Ignited Hammer for parry, and Frost Smasher for raw damage. Personally, I typically just use the Frost Smasher because when I tested it against the dragon, the max parry power possible is with our shield, so I don't really use the two-handed weapon to parry with, so it's kind of a moot point having a little bit more parry power because you're almost never going to use it. So those are the options that I take, the 4 weapons: Frost Smasher, Mace of Wrath, Sword of Radiance for regenning health, and the rare occasion we want to shoot something at a distance, the Ignited Bow. Moving on to ammunition, the only things I carry are the steel arrows and stun arrows, primarily for the dragon boss. Other than that, you can clear out pretty much anything else in the game with just your two-handed and one-handed weapons without any problems. Shouldn't have to use a bow at all. So that is the few bits of ammunition that I take. Moving on to consumables. Obviously, for the one-offs, we have 2 tiers of potions. You don't really need mana with this build, so I don't bother bringing it. I bring a bunch of the second to best revitalizing healing potions, as well as the best superior health potions. And then I like to take the improved bandages for obvious reasons. Has the best healing over time of any of the healing items. Really good for burn damage when you're going against the dragon, things like that. Moving on, we have the Wisp of Light to light up our surroundings in dark caves, things like that. The Greater Shroud Survival Flask to increase our time in the Shroud. The Elixir, which will give us a plus 30% damage modifier across the board. Really, really important for these. And then last but not least, shout out to all the people in the comments from my previous build video. Just shows how out of date and MIA I've been on this game. But I had no idea that you could actually craft your own Vakar buff altar now. So this is the buff that I dove down into the Vakar encampment in my previous Hunter build video to talk about this particular buff. But now you can just craft one of your own and use it whenever you want. The only thing I do want to mention is, for whatever reason, these altars are bugged. Even if you reset and log back in, your buff, once you pick it up, will disappear and you won't be able to get it again. To fix that, you just need to grab the buff, pick it up, equip it back on your hotbar, and then place it back down. And then once you place it back down, the buff returns and you can grab it a second time. So for whatever reason, that's a little buggy. It only lets you take it one time and then you got to replace it. But picking it up, putting it down doesn't take that long. Not a big deal. But that particular buff is going to give us, if we go to status details, another 25 health, as well as another 20% melee damage for 30 minutes. So those are all the consumables. Moving on to the food that I really recommend. We are going to be taking the enlarged stomach perk that gives us 4 food slots. The best in slots, in my opinion, that I would recommend for meat is going to be the new beef stew. This will give +4 strength, +4 health, +4 constitution, and another 3 frost resistance, so obviously really good for a warrior. Then I also like to take the stir-fried vegetables because on the rare instances, especially against the dragon boss, when the dragon is out of range, that is the only time in the damage video that I'm going to show off that I use the bow, is when I physically can't hit him with a melee weapon. Having a extra food item specifically for dexterity, because we're not putting many points into dexterity for the bow and arrow tree. This will give our bows and our stun arrows a little bit beefier of a hit, so that's why I like to take that. Next best is going to be the open sandwich. This will be considered our grain product slot. That'll give another +4 strength and another 2 constitution. And then last but not least, I like to take the pumpkin soup. This has +6 health regen, +4 stamina recharge, which is always good, and another +2 frost resistance. So all in all, those are the main food items. I put this one here as well. If you happen to be running the Hollowed Halls, these were a special consumable item made specifically for the Hollowed Halls update that came out, and you can craft these from the little evil NPC. I forget his name. He's over here. He's got the ectoplasm soup, the greater, and then the excellent. I would recommend going with the excellent. Reason being is only for the Hollowed Halls, is because what it does is it gives a minus 150 health, which you would think is bad, but it's not as bad as you think, because it gives another plus 15% bonus damage to all hollow enemies, and plus 10% life leech against hollowed enemies. So between the extra damage you're going to be doing, especially if you're using the Sword of Radiance, and the life leech, the minus 150 health really isn't that big of a deal. So that would be, I would probably swap out the stir-fried vegetables for the excellent ectoplasm soup if I was running the Hollowed Halls, because we won't be using our bow, but we do want more damage. So that would be the alternate food item there. But that is pretty much all the consumables. The last thing that I want to bring up is the skill tree and our attributes. So if we go into the build, as you can see, we're taking barely any points for Ranger. But one thing that I am utilizing is as much parry power as possible, and the new grapple hook ability. So we're taking Giant Slayer Hook to grapple towards larger enemies. You can do this against the dragon as well, to get up on top of his back. Also the grounding hook, which will allow you to pull flying enemies like those whelplings closer to you, so that you can kill them with a melee weapon more easily. You don't have to use your bow. This key perk right here, the grounding hook in particular, is what's going to allow us to kill almost everything in the game with our melee weapon and not have to use the bow as much. But then I also take Merciless Attack as well as Power Parry to increase the enemy's stun bar more when getting a successful parry. And obviously, if you stun an enemy after parrying, being able to do a Merciless Attack is pretty much an instant kill on a normal enemy. So really good early perks for a warrior there. But moving on to the tank tree, we're going to take the point in Constitution, followed by Shiny Plates. Obviously, we're running a ton of physical armor, so 10% more physical resistance there. We're getting heavy plates for the maximum amount of damage our armor can mitigate, increased by 10%. For those of you that don't know, the maximum resistance that you can do with armor is 60%. So just to give you an example, if an enemy does 100 damage and you have 100 armor, the enemy will still do 40 damage to you, because the max that you can negate is 60%, or 60 points worth. However, with heavy plates, that increases it to 70%. So then the enemy would only do 30 damage to you instead of 40. So just makes your armor a little bit more efficient, followed by point in Constitution for more health, Warden and Tower for more physical and magical resistance. When there are 3 or more enemies within 20 meters, you suffer 10% less physical damage, and when there are 3 or more enemies within 20 meters, you suffer 15% less magical damage. And then point in Strength, point in Constitution, another point in Strength. We want as much strength as possible, followed by Earth Aura. Talked about this in every one of my builds. It's too good to pass up on. Shields yourself and all allies, reducing incoming damage by another 10%. And then last but not least, Thick Skin. All of these Flame Altar abilities are bugged right now. They're only capping at 3 points, even though it says you will gain 1 Constitution or 1 Intelligence for every 2 levels of Flame. And if your Flame is maxed right now, it'll be considered level 8, which means we should be getting 4 points. This build, as it stands right now, gets 29 Strength and 29 Constitution. If these perks were working properly, we would be at 30 each. I have put in a bug report. Hopefully they fix that soon. But still, the extra 3 points is really worthwhile, so I grabbed that there. We also take Evasion Attack for some more mobility attacks and evasive maneuvers. And then Battle Heal. This is what we're going to combo that I was talking about with our Sword of Radiance. When dealing critical damage with your melee weapon, you will heal 5% of your maximum health. And when you're doing a critical hit every other hit with the Sword of Radiance, you can see how fast you could build that health up with that particular weapon. So that's why we grabbed that. Moving on to the Warrior Tree. The point in Constitution for more health, followed by the Warrior's Path. When attacking with a melee weapon, all damage is increased by 10%. Then I also pick up Feast, because you want to be as tanky as possible. Meat now increases health by an additional 15%. Then we take the point in strength for obvious reasons, followed by brute and hammer time for 30% more blunt damage, as well as thrust and pierce for 30% more pierce damage. We don't need to worry about slasher or butcher because none of the weapons that we're going to be using in the best in slot for both two-handed and one-handed, with the exception of our healing sword, which isn't that big of a deal. They don't use cutting damage type. They only use blunt and piercing. So I saved the points here and only put them in the categories that we actually needed it. Next, take the point in veteran. When attacking with a melee weapon, your critical hit chance is increased by another 10%. So if you're with a sword, as I mentioned, when we're buffed, flat out, we're at 46 or 49% crit chance. But with this, we're actually 56%. So it's guaranteed every other hit, as long as we're fighting. Then we take the point in strength and constitution for more damage and more health, followed by swift blades. This says allows you to attack faster with one-handed swords and axes. It is a bit of a mistype. They're forgetting maces. This does work with one-handed maces as well. You'll notice that your mace swings will get quicker too with this ability, even though it only says swords and axes. Just know that one-handed maces do work with it as well. And then followed by the last point in constitution. Then moving over to the barbarian tree, this is where we're going to start focusing on our two-handed capabilities. Take the point in strength, followed by heavy-handed. An enemy's stun bar is increased by an additional 20% when attacking into their block with a melee weapon. Point in strength, point in constitution, followed by relentless. Dealing critical damage with a two-handed weapon increases your critical chance by another 10% for the next hit. And then breach. An overpowered enemy suffers 100% more melee damage for 3 seconds. If you can time this very, very quickly, and if you get lucky and the dragon, for example, lands right on top of you, that is a ton of extra damage you're going to get within the first 1 or 2 seconds because of this. Because the most damage we're going to be doing is once we stagger him and stun him. So that's a nice 100% damage boost we're getting from that. One thing I was testing out when I was trying to test the max parry build was Shockwave. Trigger a shockwave when you parry an attack or overpower an enemy. Unfortunately, through my testing, I found that it was a little underwhelming. The shockwave is actually very small. It's only like 2 or 3 meters. So you don't hit a ton of enemies. They have to literally be like right on top of each other in order for this to really do any good. When it does land, it was nice and you could stun like 4 to 5 enemies at once, but that was like a risky situation, and only when you had like 10 guys standing right on top of you, which was few and far between. They're usually spaced out like just enough to where you only get like 1 extra enemy. So I didn't really feel like it was worth the 3 points, so that's why I left it. But moving on, point in constitution for more health, followed by heavy specialization. This is a big one. Allows you to attack faster with all two-handed weapons. Followed by barbarian. You will gain 1 strength for every 2 levels of flame. This is the same thing as our thick skin, but for strength. So we got 3 more points from that. And then last but not least, we have Blood Rage. When an enemy is killed within 10 meters with a melee weapon, which we're obviously going to be doing all the time, the damage done with melee weapons is increased by another 20% for 10 seconds. So one thing that you can potentially combo if you have good timing is when those whelps spawn, you can technically leave one of them alive, and then right as you stun the boss, grapple hook one of the whelplings to you, kill it so you get 10 seconds of 20% more damage, and then use that to burn the boss down even quicker. So that is one strategy you can do. Plus, if there's just a ton of enemies around in the hollowed halls or anything like that, you're going to be killing and chain killing enemies with melee weapons anyway. So this is a really good perk to have in those scenarios as well. So that's why we take it. But moving on, just for some one-off more constitution and strength type perks, we have the point in strength and the athlete tree. Jump attack, we are going to be getting jump attack 2 because we're going to be smashing heads with our two-handed hammer a lot, especially in hollowed halls. Followed by point in strength and vigorous deflection. You gain 30 stamina when you parry an enemy's attack, which we can do quite a bit with this particular build. Then Blood Warrior, which spawns a health orb after defeating an enemy with a sneak attack or merciless attack. This can be helpful in a pinch because you get a bunch of basically invulnerability frames during the merciless attack animation. So you would just parry, stun a bunch of guys, do a merciless attack, and then just instantly spawn a health orb to get a bunch of health back. So that's nice there. Next, point in strength, point in constitution, and another point in constitution for more health and more damage. Then we take double jump for obvious reasons, and jump attack 2 for more downward smash damage with our two-handed weapons, followed by runner, endurance, and wanderlust for more endurance efficiency when sprinting on roads and things like that. Then good metabolism, which a mana, health, and stamina orbs do 30% bonus instead of 10%. This does combo with Blood Warrior or the health orb that can spawn, so it'll be 30% more health instead of 10. So that's good there. But it also gives our health potions 20% more efficiency as well. Point and rebound to increase base stamina regeneration by 50%. Sweet Tooth, this one isn't a big one. We're not really using sweets for the top tier consumable item options, but we're taking it in order to get the point and dexterity for a little bit more bow damage and dessert stomach to get that 4th food slot. And then last but not least, the build wouldn't be a build without updraft. So we take the point and dexterity again for a little bit more bow damage, and then airborne and updraft to have a more efficient glider. So all in all, pretty much every melee based stat is going to be maxed out, both for one-handed and two-handed use cases. So really good there. With Battle Heal, we get almost infinite health regeneration with our Sword of Radiance that we're going to be taking along with us. And then for all those flyers, because we want to be the most hardcore warrior possible, we're using that grounding hook to pull all of those flying enemies closer to us so we can take them down with our melee weapons instead of a bow and arrow. And I'll show that off a lot in the dragon boss fight. I'll also probably do a Hollowed Halls clip as well, just to show how fast you can clear out those with the two-hammer bashing method as well with this build. But that is the new and improved warrior build for the Frozen Frontier update. The final thing that I guess I can show off is our attributes once we are fully buffed. So let's go ahead and pop these here. And I'll probably use these to go straight into a dragon fight for the clip. But when we go to our attributes, we are sitting for basics, 29 constitution, 9 spirit, 10 endurance, 29 strength, which again, by the way, would be 30 each if the flame altar perks were working properly, and then 16 dexterity. So we still get decent dexterity for our bow, even though we're not speccing into it, because we have that 1 + 5 dexterity food item, and then 9 intelligence, not a big deal because we're a warrior. We also get a small little buff for reviving and revive duration, as well as a 0-second regeneration delay because of our boots for stamina regen and 10% health regen. Moving on to damage, we have 164% critical damage bonus, as well as with this particular weapon, if I go over and put an actual weapon on, Sword of Radiance, for example, we're sitting at 46% base critical strike chance. That will become 56 with the perk once we actually start attacking, and it'll be, what is it, I think 15% less than that for any other weapon that doesn't have precise on it, so still really good. We also get the 4% bonus to melee foes because of our armor, 15% bonus with one-handed weapons. This could be two-handed depending on which pair of gloves you use. And then for protection, we have a somewhat decent, well-rounded physical and magical resistance, 340 physical resistance, and then 227 magical resistance, so not bad there. We have the 178 parry power because of our shield that we're using, but that will actually increase by up 40 more points if we use the gold helmet for that scenario. But then look at these main attributes. We're sitting at 1,875 health, 280 mana, and 472 stamina, with that 175 melee damage rating. So crazy warrior melee damage and a pretty well-rounded resistances across the board. The double 30 perks, almost 30 perks is crazy for health and strength. So really, really good all-around warrior build. I min-maxed all of our resistances by weaving in some hunter armor pieces as well. So really, really fun, and I think you guys are going to find the dragon boss fight pretty interesting. The parries, when you have max parry power on a warrior, actually do a ton of stun meter gauge. You can almost get a third to a half of the dragon's stun bar with just one 2 reflection block of the dragon's meteor attack. So it still is pretty great, crazy, and on par with like the stun arrows and whatnot. You can do it pretty quickly. I'll probably take them down in about the same time that I took them down with my wizard, which is still pretty impressive given you're not using any range whatsoever really. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed it, if you found it informative, Be sure to smash that like button, comment down below. I appreciate all of your guys' feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my future content, I have one more special build that I plan on releasing for the Hunter here soon. So feel free to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss out on that. And then last but not least, if you want to join a killer community of like-minded gamers, feel free to check the links down below and join us on the Discord. We've got over 1,000 members in there now, many of which are playing Enshrouded. So hopefully you jump in and we see you guys around here soon. But until the next one, hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you all later.